could you please introduce yourself and share your primary role in the film industry?
My name is Aashish Kumar, and I am a higher education professional. I have been teaching in higher education for almost 30 years now. Currently, I'm a professor of television studies and production and immersive media at Hofstra University School of Communication. I'm also an independent documentary maker. I have done several commissioned as well as independent documentaries on a range of issues, going from bias crimes to mental illness to LGBTQ intergenerational stories.
Hey, thank you. And then which of your credits as a role or roles, whether it's editing or something else, like which make you the most excited and proud?
Um, I think the in documentaries, producing a documentary and conceiving the idea, but also then seeing it taking shape in the editing room. So those two roles, I would say the producing and the editing part, I am most excited about because as you're gathering the material in the field, you're already thinking about how it might get shaped into the final narrative. And I'm most enthralled when, yes, it is daunting because when you're doing a documentary edit, there's a like the material that's facing you is immense, but to be able to select and shape a narrative that is compelling and evocative of the story, to me, that is really creatively very satisfying.
Thank you. And your favorite aspect of post-production?
Once you get past the first assembly, when you actually start to listen and think about images and connections and relationships between what people are saying and what if it's an ensemble cast that you're editing, or if it's even one or a story about a single individual or a few individuals around them. um, I tell my students also the real excitement of edit begins once you have something in the timeline, because till then what you're doing is a lot of housekeeping, a lot of arranging, managing, so you have easily accessible material that you know where it lives. But it really, the sparks really start to come alive, and you start to kind of really get buried in the story as you start to watch the timeline. And I have a colleague who sometimes refers to the process of making a story as a picture puzzle. And maybe he does that to make his students understand it. But to me, it's only partly true that it's a picture puzzle, because a picture puzzle assumes that you already have a pre-formed story and all you're doing is making pieces fit. But I have seen, as I'm sure any editor will testify, that the stories actually meander and take shape and go in different directions from this pre-conceptualized picture puzzle that you may have started with. So I think that part always excites me as to how stories take a turn and how an image and word in the timeline speak differently. They may have lived in a different place, but once you put them together, I mean, that's the true power of editing, is when you place things next to each other and when they start to speak in a different way.
Awesome. Super awesome. I love the picture puzzle analogy. I use it myself. And I always say you're not always just putting the puzzle together, but sometimes you're going out and getting the puzzle pieces.
That's good too.
Uh, well, the other side of that, we all know editing can be long and frustrating. What is your least favorite part of it?
I would say it used to be the transcription process. Back in the day, when there was no speech recognition software, and it was all had to be done. And if you were working on tight budgets, you ended up doing some of that yourself. The advantage to that was that you are intimately familiar with the material, and you knew exactly what people had said, and it was kind of burned in your head as you went through the process. But it took time, and it kept you from, because inside you wanted to just get to cutting the story, and you couldn't do it because you didn't know word for word what was said. Thankfully, that's been sort of taken care of with a lot of very smart transcription software. um, at this point, my least favorite is logging and getting everything organized and labeled properly. I still err sometimes. I still leave us a bunch of things just broadly labeled the bin and I leave the contents kind of unlabeled. But I think those are the time-consuming things that as an editor, they will come back to haunt you because you will be scrolling through a bin trying to find that clip that lives there, but you haven't labeled it. So I think some of those parts are frustrating. I think towards the tail end of the post process, once you have the film kind of finished, again, depending on the budgets, and I often work I'm a complete end-to-end editor. So I will color correct, I'll mix sound. But lately I've had some help. Sometimes the color correction process can be very time consuming because you're going frame by frame, and sometimes you have multiple shots from multiple sources. So I would say those two are not the most favorite parts.
Okay, awesome. We could talk about that part forever, I'm sure. All right, how did you get, so let's move to the getting started section. Could you please share how you got your start? Not in film and video, and if you did something in storytelling, because a lot of people have something prior to, if you have something
Mm.
to that, as well,
Yeah.
to get your start.
In terms of my start, I had a somewhat non-traditional, although I'm sure a lot of people have gotten into film from various disciplines and they might not have started out as a film student. I, for one, did not start out studying film. So I grew up in India, and at the time that I was in college, which is in the mid to late 80s, there was only one film school in the entire country, and you had to get into it right after getting out of high school. So it was a 5 year, it was like a more traditional old style film school. And I I was doing sociology in college, and I did my undergraduate and graduate work in sociology. And at the time that I was doing my grad school, I took a class in semiotics with an amazing intellectual and professor who is now teaching at Johns Hopkins, and she introduced me to my first cinema studies text and to the idea that cinema was something worth studying as opposed to simply, because if you grew up in India, for most people in India, cinema meant the Mumbai film industry, which is known as its somewhat derisive term, Bollywood. Um, and the idea that filmmaking was an enterprise that you could not just learn the craft, but also study as a social text or as a text about as a cultural text. That excited me a lot. So my transition took place after grad school when I was looking for film programs, and I came to the US to study for the first time in my life to do a grad program in communication. It took 2 degrees. I had an MA, MS, and an MFA in television production. After which, I started looking at how I could find a place in this world of of making of creative work, and academia presented a nice option because I had spent all this time in academia. I had spent a lot of time working with students as a TA, and I had also developed an interest in a certain type of film that I wanted to do, which was documentary work, but documentary work involving working closely with communities and figuring out from their cultural texts, from their world, what could be the material for representation, as opposed to assuming that there was a universal way of telling a story, a universal language of cinema. So those were some of the issues that were deeply they came from some of my sociological studies, but the interest in working in images, the interest in having some way of making change and impact through the stories were some of the big questions that I came out with. And it took a while. I started out doing some commission work for a local nonprofit. And then I would say the big transition point which I credit both with my filmmaking, with the biggest filmmaking project that I got in my early start, but also becoming activated as a South Asian into the politics of race and identity. They both happened simultaneously. So there was I had founded with another South Asian friend of mine a society for a South Asian Film and Video Association, because we saw that there was a lack of community amongst many people from in the diaspora. And we had a website. We got a lot of people to kind of write in, and we were developing that as a resource for the community. And somebody saw that website, somebody who was in the activism, progressive activism kind of community, and called me asking if I would want to be a consultant on a documentary project that she was developing at the time about bias crime, about hate crimes against South Asians. And so we had a very long conversation, about half an hour, 40-minute long conversation. And when I hung up, it occurred to me that I wasn't going to be a consultant on this. I wanted to do this. So I threw my hat in, I wrote the proposal, I sent it in, and I got picked. At the time, my ex-wife and I, we used to work together on projects, and so we would always pitch as a duo. And that project really sort of was a baptism by fire in the world of field production, in the world of, it was a national spread. We traveled to 4 cities: DC, Chicago, LA, and of course within New York. And what was really transformative about that project is it was about hate crimes. We were doing a history of bias crimes and hate crimes against South Asians, and we had a rough cut ready in October of 2000, August of 2001. And a month later, September 11th happened. And there was a rash of attacks against people of South Asian descent, whether it was a Sikh, whether it was somebody brown who had a beard like me, whether it was actually, it didn't matter whether you were a Muslim or you just had to look like somebody who was one of the 19 hijackers whose photos were being printed. And that really made me, in terms of filmmaking, when you have to transform the film midstream and its agenda shifts by real world events that are happening, to me, that was really powerful. And I'll never forget how that shaped me as a filmmaker, both in terms of how I responded as a South Asian who was getting activated into the identity politics of South Asian diaspora, but also as a filmmaker who had to learn that the definition of film resonates with what is happening in the contemporary ferment in the moment, and how you have to respond to that. And that has always remained with me.
Wow, what an amazing story. That's incredible. Like the timing of that, obviously the things you can't predict, but having something like that ready right at that moment.
Yeah, yeah. No, I remember coming. I was teaching in New Haven, Connecticut at the time, and I remember coming down to Queens, to Richmond Hill, which is one of the neighborhoods which is populated by a lot of people from the Sikh community, and they have a temple, a Sikh temple, which is called a Gurudwara. And there's this old, 70, 75-year-old Sikh gentleman with a white flowing beard. I mean, the very image of a saint, right? We went to interview him, and that story was just so powerful that it sort of ripped the mask off of the civility that I thought that American society was all about, rule of law, that when it came to when the chips were down, how would people react? And he was coming from the Gurudwara after a prayer meeting, and these guys jumped out of a pickup truck, and they had baseball bats, and what they did was they had nails studded into the baseball bats that they were going around picking on people, and he happened to be the unlucky victim that day. So he crawled home half bloodied. His daughter-in-law helped him, into, and that story was like happened just a few weeks before we went and interviewed him. That was very powerful. That I really, I think I credit that experience of listening to these stories, developing a way of becoming a recorder, a witness to them. That was very transformative for me.
Yeah. And amplifying them to the
Yeah,
right ears and eyes. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to transition from the meaning and the impact to back to the industry, but I do want to go back to
Sure.
the paid or serious job, because part of the goal of this book is to help people find their entry points. And what was your entry point, and what do you consider your first paid or serious job? Was that it? Because you mentioned you had some commission jobs.
Yeah, yeah. So this was the project. So I realized that um, I had no track record of doing a project of that scope, of handling a subject that involved such a massive number of people and the impact on the community and so on. Um, so I was learning what budgeting meant, and very quickly, because the funders, they had a limited pot of money, and everything had to be done within that. And we just said yes, because I was so hungry to work on this project. I wanted to do it because it seemed exactly the kind of thing, the kind of story that I would want to tell. It had the elements of the community that I had some knowledge of, and I would want to know more. So that would be the first big project that I got. And, of course, it meant, it was from conception to delivery. So it was not one piece of it. I understood that very well, that I would be responsible, or rather we would be responsible for the entire project. Yeah.
Wow. Do you mind sharing, or can you share the name of the organization?
Sure, sure. So at that time, this organization was getting founded. It was called SAALT, SALT. So it was South Asian Americans Leaders of Tomorrow. Um, I don't know if they're still around. I believe they are, because this film was very formative in that organization's coming into the center of South Asian politics at that time. Because as you can imagine, because we had the ability to respond to the 9/11 events, we had the film ready by November of that year. And we were screening all throughout the country, from, the Southern Poverty Law Center to Chicago to LA, at the Smithsonian, at NYU, wherever there was a need for stories to respond to the moment. So I think that was part of the organization's mandate, to bring the South Asian community together and be able to respond to threats of racial violence and so on. And fortunately or unfortunately, we were part of that in the moment, right?
Yeah. Wow. Wow. So picking up on the paid job and getting this like starting point, we all tell students, you've got to network, you've got to build a reel, you've got to build your skills, like, knowing that somewhere it's kind of like throwing stuff against the wall, something's going to work.
Yeah.
For you, do you feel like there was one particular thing that really helped you advance? Was it having these specific, like kind of high profile or really responsive documentaries, or was it something else?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's very true that um, if you do work that impacts communities, and as of course there is the artistic satisfaction part, where you're all doing a combination of, when you work in documentary, you're not just an artist, you are a public intellectual or public artist who's sharing something of values, entering into a discourse. Uh, Through that project, my work and the ability for producing something like that became known in the community. And it's interesting, because I got a call a few years down after that film was finished, from somebody in New Jersey who used to head a mental health organization called NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness. And she had reached out to people that she knew in the South Asian network, and the executive producer of the hate crimes piece happened to be one of those people she reached out to. She immediately mentioned my name to her. So you can see that, of course, in the diaspora, you're not talking about a very, very large number of people, but there are a few filmmakers. And then once you have proven that you can commit to a project and you can see it through, and you're not just doing it because you're looking for it as a commission piece, that your involvement in the project far exceeds the remit. And that led to two other projects with NAMI. So I would say, I think one doesn't commit to a project knowing that that's a networking opportunity, But what one does within that, what was done with that first opportunity, for instance, marks the way forward to the network that you are not even aware that it's going to be created because of that. Absolutely. I think I tell students all the time that whether it's a PA job, whether you're doing a 1 day gig for somebody, you don't go in looking to just saying, how much money am I going to make? Because if that's the outlook, then you're not going to get the impact, because you're doing it because you can't wait to get paid for it. So yeah, I know that there's a lot of exploitation in our industry. There are a lot of underpaid gigs. There's a lot of uncertainty around freelancing and so on. But it's also true that people remember uh, who you worked with and how well you worked or how committed you were. And I think those things do matter, especially when you're doing a producing a project, your commitment to seeing it through, and how badly you wanted to get it finished, or how badly you want to extend it. So we had a budget that we started out with the hate crimes piece, but as it grew in momentum and its significance, we wanted to do more things. And so we were able to go out, and the executive producer at the time was able to go out and get more funding. And the fact that we committed ourselves to expanding the scope of the project was not lost on her. That we weren't just like, okay, that's what you asked us to do, we're going to do that. And yeah, the stuff that's happening, yeah, we're not really prepared for that. But to be able to respond to that was, I think, important. I'd say, in short, yes, uh, the way that you approach a project defines, to a large extent, how people connected to that project will remember you, and to the extent that they will pass it on to the next person who comes looking. Yeah.
That's great. That's great advice. Kind of picking up on that, and this again just speaks to like the goal of this book being how do you get your first jobs. Can you speak to contemporary hiring processes from wherever that matters, or is relevant for you? Like Ali spoke about it from faculty hiring processes. Zeb talked about she actually doesn't hire that much directly, but she's often referring people, and she's always asked for like new people to bring into the industry. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, as you suggested, I'm much more familiar with academic hiring. And in the 30 odd years that I have been in academia, I have sat on many, many, many search committees, ranging from people because I might have served in communication departments or radio, TV, film department. But when it comes to film and television hiring, um, some of the changes that I'm seeing is in the in the field of film studies, you have a small number of positions and you have an inordinate number of people out there applying for those. So there are PhDs who are, I mean, the volume of people that have PhDs who are looking for film studies jobs that are few and far between is daunting. Couple of things about live television versus television, which is single camera. And we are seeing this big shift right now where live television is on the outs. Very few things are getting done. It's all live. It's about events, about sports, about the news. So there's a residual number of things that are now remaining in the live arena. And when you are hiring somebody, we have in our program, we came out of a very studio. We had the biggest non-commercial soundstage in Long Island. We were the site of a lot of soap operas that were getting produced. We would often rent our facilities to PBS to do, talk shows and so on. And over time, we saw that the value of that diminished to the point where students were looking for more single camera, more drama, more script writing experience. And I think it's a reflection of how the streaming networks and the whole change in the model of cable and broadcast to streaming impacted the number of opportunities for single camera scripted kind of television shows. Um, when we tried to hire for narratives in television, one of my experiences was the lines between people that were doing work in television, who were former cinema or independent filmmakers or scriptwriters for film, who are now looking to television as just another way of telling a story, episodically or serially. Um, it was interesting because there was no such thing as a television graduate that you wanted to hire for television jobs. And there were cinematographers who could teach. There were people who were editors who could teach in either. There were producers who were working in both industries. And it made it really difficult, especially in streaming, where if you went out looking for somebody in narrative television, it was very hard to find someone who could teach narrative television because they were out being hired by the industry. And most of the television folks who had studied television in universities and their MFA programs had come from either documentary backgrounds or they had done live TV. So it was, we're at this, interesting inflection point where the industry changes haven't percolated quite to the academia in MFA programs and so on. So we have far fewer programs that recognize this shift that converges television and cinema to the point of streaming narratives. And I think we see that a lot, that discussion is ongoing. And that was really challenging when we tried to hire somebody for narrative television, episodic narrative television. Um, I think for documentaries, you get a far easier way of the pool of candidates is far bigger. There are many, many more documentary programs in MFA, but MFA programs historically have either focused on documentary or narrative cinema. This new breed of episodic, it was never a thing in storytelling that was taught at the college level. So I think that's one challenge that we find. Um, in post-production, we have never had a problem hiring people because in post, you're looking for somebody that is either a seasoned editor who has done their work. And when we hired the person who leads our post strand right now, he came off of having worked as a lead editor for a major post-production house in New York City in the days that you used to have post houses. Um, and when in the 90s, when Final Cut Pro and Avid came out, and people started buying their own computers, they shut down, and he was a great find at that time. Um, but I think the hardest hires for us right now are in narrative television because it's a very interesting time period, which you don't see the talent out there as much as you do in doc and filmmaking. Yeah.
Yeah, and that people who work in the industry and people who teach, it's not always, they don't always mix the same way that.
Yeah, and the other thing that I want to add is that there's I'm also somebody who has invested a lot of time in new media, the so-called new media world, which is interactive storytelling, virtual reality, augmented reality, and I think, again, when you start to hire in those fields, it's very difficult to find people with a track record who are willing to go to academia at the time when the industry demand is just so much more compelling. So that's another challenge in academia is when you float new programs, finding the right people for them in emerging technologies can be very tricky. I think for me personally, the interesting growth in, in narrative techniques is not going to happen as much in what we call legacy media as it might in these very new plastic ways of storytelling that live on multiple devices that may have a counterpart in the legacy world, but they're doing more with it. They might be adding to it, might be extending the narrative. I'm very drawn to the idea of a living story where documentaries can, don't just have to be finished and then shipped and then you're done with it, but something that actually can be added, something can complement, something that can be sort of a living history idea. And it's not easy to do that in the legacy media world. But these new ways of storytelling are certainly allowing for shorter but much more impactful ways in which stories can be told. But again, when it comes to hiring for those positions, yeah, I mean, you're looking at a very challenging landscape. Yeah.
Yeah, and the short form in all that episodic, we still really haven't found a commercial place for short form media, except for like social media ads and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Gaming is one place where a lot of people who have that skill set, they get hired for game design, because that's actually a revenue making part of the industry. But in our field, in documentary or a narrative, there's not much, because devices like headsets and so on have not found the kind of distribution, and frankly, people's ability to get access to projects through platforms, the equivalent of Netflix, if you may, for VR and AR, hasn't come about. They're out there, the Oculus Studio or Steam and so on, but they don't rival the ease with which people are able to access content. And until we get to that point, you won't see the growth that these media, in my view, deserve.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, that's super interesting too. Again, I could keep going, but stick to the questions because I'm paying attention to time. You touched on this in a couple of your other questions, but in terms of your perspective as an editor and how it's unique, because you just talked about the interactive aspect of that, but maybe, we'll just touch on this briefly. Like, how do you feel your perspective as an editor is unique?
So when I was working on on several of these projects, which involved traveling and interviewing multiple people, and my style of interviewing is somewhat in depth. So I don't like to cut people off. I don't like to shape the responses to an editorial, mandate. So I would edit these projects, and there would be just such a wealth of stuff that never made it, and as any editor would be, would attest to. And I started thinking about the efficiency of what I was doing, and whether there was a way for these stories to have a different form in which, either editorially as well as structurally, they might find um, uh, the better use of the material, or that use might be extendable, as opposed to, I have only 30 minutes, so I'm going to make a 30-minute film, and then everything else has to, be in the bins. Um, eh, so I was attracted by the gaming model, where narratives can be, an experience for a game can be 20 minutes long, or it can be 2.5 hours long, depending on how you were able to find those, Easter eggs. And it kind of is an expandable kind of this accordion model of storytelling that compelled me to sort of think about, if somebody wanted to take a deep dive, they would not maybe be satisfied with just a 15-minute short, but they might want to explore it in other ways. Also, this idea of multi-perspective storytelling. Oftentimes I found myself having to balance out or counter or do kind of montages of people's interviews that either supported or conflicted with, or affirmed each other's narratives, but they had to live in the same space. And I was thinking about a story at that time where giving space to just one person's story was more important as part of what the story demanded. So in particular, I'll mention, so I was working on a project, I'm still am actually, about LGBTQ stories involving a family and an LGBTQ identifying family member. What I found in my research, and this is one aspect where the editorial and the structural decisions for that project was informed by the research that I did for the project. What I found is that both individuals, whether it was a family member or a queer person, were hungry for spaces that spoke to their story and their journey, um, irrespective of other people who were around them. But it centered them. And I think it's false to say it was just their journey, but it centered them in their journey. And I struggled with the narrative forms that I had been working with at that point. I was saying, oh, every time I cut from one family member to the queer person, I'm taking time away from that journey, and I'm kind of diluting, and also for the person that's watching it, for whom I was making this film. So this idea of audience-centric structure of storytelling. So I ended up deciding that I would create two channels of stories. And this became a multi-channel, if you may, experience, where a parent who had their own journey would be able to speak just about that. And it would be much more internal as opposed to referential, because like that person was doing this, I responded to that. It was be more about what they were feeling. And that became the heart of the story. Then I had to come up with a device that would address this multi-channel thing. And that's where interactive story for me became a useful way, where using modern media, for instance, the developments in coding on the internet, HTML5, WebGL, they opened the pathway for me to even conceptualize a store, a storage for these stories, which will allow a navigation that wasn't overly complicated, but it was also a place for multi-path storytelling. So that's one example where it was a combination of early research coming to a sort of a crossroads in terms of making a decision as to how I would address what I was finding out in the field, and finding the technology and the editorial style that would work for that. So these stories are not 30-minute long narratives, but they're shorter narratives that might total up to 30, 40 minutes. And you may not even finish the narrative completely, just like in a game. You might just follow a queer person's journey, and that might be a 10-minute or a 15-minute short film that you have just watched. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, wow. That is because it's a super unique story. And I've not even heard of that kind of interactive two-sided or multi-sided, because there's more than two sides in, LGBT stories that are not South Asian, but you got very specific to this particular audience that you wanted to reach. And, how can they ingest it so that it's comfortable and they're hearing all of it? That's amazing.
Yeah.
That takes so much concept and pre-production and sort of design and planning.
Oh, absolutely. You said it. In terms of my editorial head, I had to fit in new partnerships. I had to fit in new collaborators, and I had to figure out the entire process by which a project is structured, designed forward, and then the stories will live within that. But it had to be resonating with both. The stories weren't just going to be a little play button. It had to organically live within the design ecosystem. And I think that was a big learning for me, is working with designers and illustrators who would draw from the stories, and the stories would draw from the design. It was, I would say, almost like a new stream of editing and filmmaking for me.
It is, because it's
Yeah,
not at all legacy media where it's like it's just going to be this linear thing in the end. Yeah. Wow.
yeah,
Super cool. We can write a book about media form
yeah.
another time. Last question, simple one. What's your software of choice? You
So
know,
right now I am fully in the Adobe Creative Cloud universe. So I use Premiere as my main editing tool. Um, I use After Effects. It's just easier to stay within the Adobe system. And Adobe has developed, both from the teaching point of view, as well as from my personal point of view. So I live in these two divided worlds. So my work is all Avid Media Composer.
mhm.
Uh, my school has historically committed to being an Avid school. And there were good reasons for that, because many places, as you know, whether it's broadcast networks, whether it's big doc houses, or even big reality and docu-series kind of places, uh, prefer the robustness of the Avid software. A lot of independent people, students included, find it easier to learn media, Adobe Premiere on their own. So I get this interesting mix. My personal work is very much about working with Premiere, whereas my at work we have Avid, and I see the good and bad of both. I think Adobe is more nimble, is able to respond to what's happening. Thinking about cloud-based editing, thinking about collaborative editing, but Avid has for years dominated the post space, and is still a calling card for a lot of people who are looking for editors. Do you know Avid? Because Avid, you do have to learn Avid in a certain specific way. Whereas with Adobe and with Final Cut Pro, there's many ways to kind of get in, and it's like a more like a software or more like an app, whereas Avid is like a system. You must do certain things in a certain way.
Oh my gosh, so true. I teach both Avid and Premiere, and I like literally almost exactly say the same things. I'm like, you need to know both. And Avid's just so particular when you get it started up. It's like getting into the Fort Knox or something of software.
Yeah, yeah. You have to have this exact sequence. You have to punch with this key card. You have to have a retinal scan, and you have to go into the vault after that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on to favorite films and inspirations. What are some of your favorite scenes, or do you have favorite scenes that, or favorite films that you like to refer to for editing and their style?
Um, I think editorially, I'm kind of old school. I harken back to times where I personally felt a revelation from watching something. One of the television shows that did that for me, and film has always had its innovators. Film has always been much more plastic in terms of technique. Television moves less radically, and is much more traditional in repeating its formula. I remember watching Homicide: Life on the Street, which is a show from the 80s, and it's dated because my students like, what, who, what, where. And they used a certain style of sound editing where the dialogue of the next scene, not just the ambient sound, but the dialogue of the next scene would start permeating through an existing, as the scene was ending. And I found that so profound because like how, kind of think about uh, pieces of film as not butt spliced, but kind of like this dovetail, they're kind of intermeshing and interlocking. Um, I would say, broadly speaking, I always think about editing styles that pay more attention, not just pay attention equally to how the film is moving longitudinally, but also latitudinally. What is happening across what you're listening to in the background, what the dialogue is doing, what the score is doing, and also what other images are doing in connection with the main story. Being a documentary maker, I love stories which allow for us to think about more historic, traditional ways of doing. For instance, simple things like we use a lot of archival material in documentaries, and there are always interesting ways in which people have presented archival footage. One of my most vivid memories is the film Atomic Cafe, which was made from FO, what is it called, Freedom of Information Act, or access to archival material that the filmmakers requested. And I always think about telling students that if you're looking to work in archive, there's no better model to look at than the Atomic Cafe. But more contemporary films, I think of Strong Island as one of my favorite documentary films that makes such creative use of photographs that traditionally, yes, it's an effective, but also a very tired style, the Ken Burns, pan and zoom kind of stuff. But Strong Island makes such wonderful use of photographs laid out by the person. So you see the person who is looking at the photographs, and it's not just the filmmaker who has scanned them and taken them to another place. So there's a very strong linkage between the person looking at the film and the viewer looking at these photographs with them. Those are a few that come to mind in the interactive world. My inspiration for the kind of stories that resulted in Body Home World, which is the interactive project that we were discussing, was a Canadian series done by Kat Zizek from the National Film Board of Canada, which was called High Rise. And High Rise was a 5-year multi-part project that was funded, God bless tax-funded filmmaking, because that form of experimentation would not find a place in the American ecosystem. But the Canadians pulled it off. And it's such a thoughtful, innovative, path-breaking series of films that, unfortunately, with the death of Flash, many parts of that project are no longer available to the wider public. I'm sure that in the Wayback Machine, there are screen grabs and so on. But that's one of the perils, is if you move one of the pieces out, it's like Jenga, it just falls apart. unlike old media, which is there. It's like it's going to be in a DVD or a tape. You can always find it to go back. But things on the internet, not so.
Oh, yeah, preservation. Yeah. Wow. I loved High Rise. I remember that. That was really interesting. Very
Yeah.
interactive documentary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, do you have some go-to techniques in your own work? I mean, again, you kind of touched on this, but do you have some techniques that you tend to use over and over?
You mean in my teaching or my own
In
book?
your creative work, like,
Okay.
like you have techniques that when you're putting things together, you just start to go to, like you were talking about dovetailing, and do you find that just things pop up again and again?
Yeah, yeah. So um, I think for documentary makers, the historical, uh, the bedrock of starting films that involve interviews is to always know everything that has been said and delve into that material, really become familiar with that. But it's not enough to just have those words because the story is not going to be told in just words. This is not radio. So figuring out the language that will accompany those words and doing so by spending time in the shooting process so that you can kind of pre-visualize that style, that world that you want to create around this subject, uh, pays big dividends. If you have the time, if you have the budget, I would say push forward in the direction of not just thinking about the spoken word, but so I'll give you an example. So I was in India recently, filming with a trans activist in Assam, who lived along, who spoke very fondly of this river that flowed near the city of Guwahati, where she lived, and people in Assam have a very strong relationship with this river. There are songs written about it. There are festivals that happen. There are fish markets all along it. And to me, I heard that phrase during the interview and I kind of filed it away and I was going through the transcript and I saw that she mentions that I'm like the Brahmaputra, flowing with it, changing with it. And that metaphor, that is a key. I think for all filmmakers to find, if you're lucky enough that your participants or your subjects, however you refer to them, I prefer participants, have given you something, and they all have, but it's hidden somewhere. If you can find it, then it shapes. So I made sure that I filmed as many things around the Brahmaputra, whether it was the setting sun, whether it was people that live off of the river with the fishermen, or whether it was simply cities that have grown alongside the Brahmaputra. Because, and then you do this in a structured way, your audiences will pick up on the fact that it's the title of a recent book that I read, The Covenant of Water. Water is a connective tissue in our life and how it sort of builds communities. And so I think enriching your work and infusing it with metaphors that have something to do with your character, not just your own imposition and your own kind of non-diegetic kind of insertion into the work. To me, that's very powerful.
Wow, I love that. So music for Body Home World. How did you find music, and how is that, how did you work on the score for that?
Um, So there were two types of music that I was looking for this for the project. One that would be part of the documentary shorts, which be more traditional, but I also needed to make sure that the site in which the stories live, they have they're not just divorced from the music that is in the stories, the diegetic and the non-diegetic music that I'm using within the stories. So I found a composer whose main work had been in for video games, and so somebody who understood the value of how you create a composition that has stems, and those stems occur in different pieces and different parts, and then they also come together. So that approach was very valuable in creating pieces that used the entire composition, but on the website, we were using a stem or a sound that you may have heard in the piece. If you paid attention, of course, the idea is never to identify something very, very clearly, but overall it coheres. So that approach really paid well. And so we worked because he had done the music for each of the short pieces, and they were all unique. They had their moments, and he was able to take my cues and make transformations in the existing pieces so that the foregrounding, the backgrounding of instrumentation, of poignancy, and those were taken care of. But when it came to the website, the interactions themselves had to be in some ways punctuated. So it's tricky on a website if you click on something and you don't get some type of a feedback, whether it's a click or whether it's a sound or something changes on the screen. And if it's too silent, then it's eerie because all of a sudden the video playback begins and that's full of sounds, but the website is silent. So he was instrumental in working through that process with when you, for instance, the website has a mandala, which is comprised of WebGL three-dimensional particles. And you can actually take your mouse, or if you're working on a touch device, you can turn the mandala in the other direction. That turning has a sound that comes from reversing one of the music beds that was used in the film. So you went about it kind of thoughtfully, not borrowing or cobbling together pieces, but working off of a piece whose stems served in various directions. For the piece that I was working with in Assam, I was very clear that I wanted sounds from the region and that people would identify, that there wouldn't be just generic music, which is, has its function. But I was really lucky to find a composer who was from Guwahati, which is the capital city, who had studied jazz at the Berklee School of Music and was able to take folk compositions, but also do improvisational work that made it more contemporary. And it was, in documentary world, you have to work with the blessings of the entire world because the money is not going to make it all happen. Yeah. So I wrote to this composer, and all I did told him was a brief of the film. And his immediate response was, you're welcome to use the work because you're doing it for awareness and educational reasons, and I'm happy to be part of it. He didn't even ask to see a cut of the film to approve how I had used this film. I mean, I have to say, for a creative person, when you have conceptualized something and done something without the context of it being used in a film, it has its purpose, it has its vision in how you thought of it. To give it to somebody, it's like your child or your baby that you're letting in the hand of another person. I was really blessed because I just sent him the finished cut of the film, and in a very respectable way, I sort of said, I'm giving this back to you with trepidation because I have changed the context of your music. I have used it in a different way. And he wrote me a beautiful email saying that he was so happy to see how thoughtfully his songs had been used and how they had been given a new life in the context of this film that he hadn't even thought of. Um, I do think that looking for things that you believe belong within the film and not being satisfied until you find them. And of course, luck is a big part of it. Finding this composer was for me a big stroke of fortune. Um, and it really impacts the film. I mean, don't let anyone tell you that music is an afterthought. It is the sound of the film, right? Um, yeah, so students, when I'm teaching, to kind of switch my hats, um, especially students who work on camcorders, which record sound as an after, as a, it's like it's happening. I'm going to pay attention to the film. The sound is just getting recorded. I always think about, like, okay, if you're not wearing headphones on a shoot, then you're not listening. You're just watching. You might see the views move, but you're not really listening to the quality of it. So I try to inculcate in them, not just thinking about the visual, but also the ambience and how the ambience can be, can become a part of this, the location, the space, um, and really having them hunt through musical scores until they find what they're looking for. So I recently finished a big project with my senior film class, a senior television film class, where they've created a docuseries following an a cappella group on campus that traveled through different parts of Long Island and to Boston, taking part of this intercollegiate a cappella championship. And they were trying to find music bits for it because there were transitions and there were things that, the music for the film was pretty much the group singing. So we didn't really need as much music, but we needed for transitions. And he downloaded about 40 cuts. And to demonstrate that the need to listen to each of them, we were using Frame.io. I went to 20 of them and made annotations about its quality, what it said to me, just to kind of demonstrate to them that all pieces have a unique quality. You can't just say, drag it into the timeline and then leave it, leave the audiences deal with the dissonance that it might create. So absolutely essential.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. How did you find that composer? Were you just searching for him online or just a referral from a friend or something?
Yeah, so I initially I did a search for Assamese folk music composers, and I came across a lot of traditional stuff. There were many because that region is known for its folk music. And then I found one live show that the singer and he had done, and I saw his name, and of course, down I went the rabbit hole, and I ended up finding him online, and had to get to him through multiple ways, some social media, his email. Uh, as any filmmaker will tell you, you have to be like almost like a private eye when you want to work on a film. You got to persist, you have to be creative and reaching out to people. But it's driven by this desire to have something.
And it's absolutely true that the uniqueness, it stays with you. It's like
Yeah,
that aftertaste is often coming from the score. And
yeah, yeah.
true. Okay, so film industry questions and these developments in post-production. We talked a little bit about HTML5 and the death of Flash and different things, as well as different software. But are there tools or software or new developments that you're really excited about?
Absolutely. So, I, I saw a transition from tape-based editing to nonlinear, to the use of DV cam and digital video on tape, to SD cards, and now I think the next era is cardless, cloud-based editing. I think it for large projects, it is really the solution that we have been waiting for. We just didn't know. And companies like Lucid Link, Frame, and then I'm sure there'll be many, many more that are allowing for uh, not quicker than real time, but faster than the average upload speeds for other cloud-based services like Google Drive or OneDrive or what have you. They have figured algorithms that allow for real-time access. So there's amazing developments. I mean, I saw a demo of Lucid Link at NAB last year, and I couldn't believe that they were doing real-time editing off of the cloud. That opens up so many possibilities for collaborations throughout the globe. As somebody who works with individuals in different countries, and we've always worried about how am I going to ship things to you? Will I compress it? Will I, do proxies? All these questions that didn't have a unified answer. Uh, or within work groups that you're working with within a site. I had students working on this project that we shot a lot of stuff for, and some of them were off-site. They were commuters, so they would shoot, and the card was with them. They were uploading footage to Frame from homes, and the story editors were able to look at them, and the editor could take their selects and start working from them without us having to ship hard drives around. I think that piece is one piece of it. Collaborative editing, something that I think needs to be handled very carefully. So Adobe has built it in there, uh, within the using the cloud, Adobe Cloud and Premiere, the possibility of assistant editors and lead editors working on the same timeline and on the same project and just updating changes by simply clicking a button. I think those advances are very, very exciting for post. Um, we cannot not mention AI. The way it is changing, the radical transformations that one finds both from generative AI, which is needs to be thought of as differently from AI that is working, that is baked into systems such as color correction and sound enhancements and so on, which happen more passively without you having to type in prompts, are amazing developments. We don't quite know where these things will settle because they're being added to updates every few months. But generative AI, I think it's a whole different body of work that I think might even create a new type uh, a new species of filmmaker who comes from that world, that process. Um, so this notion of scripting a film through prompts, right? That's, I think, one way to think about prompts as the early script that may not have dialogue in it, but has descriptions, deep descriptions of scenes, of moods, and so on. And what that means for the industry of art designers and graphic people and filmmakers who are right now, will we see them being cleaved by this? Will we see them using these tools as pre-visualization tools? I mean, there's who knows what the answer to these questions are, but we are all sort of in this right now. And often when you're in something that is so nascent, to jump to any conclusion, to build a fire and talk about the death of kings, I think it's too soon for that moment. Just with any technology, I think it will evolve. Stories will triumph. I always believe that just because you're able to type a prompt doesn't mean that you have a desire for telling a story. People who have a desire for telling a story will stay with the story for a long period of time. They're not going to flirt with this idea of a quick 2-minute short that they were able to create with a prompt. So I think that's the well of story. It comes from a deeper place. It comes from a persistence. It comes from a tenacity. If you have those qualities, whether you're using AI or whether you're using traditional tools, your story is going to be reflective of the process. If you're using it just to be gimmicky and to prove that you can do something that took somebody 5 hours to do it, you might never go on to do something beyond that. So I think all these questions are, I'm planning to teach a course in generative AI for filmmaking next semester. I'm always somebody who likes to adopt technologies and not be depressed about the fact of what it's doing to my traditional crafts. And we'll see how students respond to it and what it brings to us.
Wow, very cool. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I feel like there's no point in resisting, but AI, some of the generative stuff scares me.
It is.
When
Yeah.
you go and get a transcription done, and then there's like a thing that says, or you can just write a Word document and there's it can say, which voice do you want this voiced in? And you can choose. And it's like older male, younger female, middle. It's like this is, and they sound so real. It's really,
Oh, it's the plasticity of it is insane. Yeah. I mean, who knows? I mean, we had that big controversy in the documentary world when they had Anthony Bourdain's letter read out in his voice at the end of the film.
what do you feel like are the biggest challenges in post-production now? There's, with all these developments, there's new challenges. So what do you see some of the big ones being?
So both of us, we deal with young people who are getting started, and they don't quite know, you know, whether they want to be editors, they want to be storytellers, they want to be script writers. Some of them know, some of them are just tasting. I think the trickiest part is how to, because they've already done the indoctrination of, they've come into the world of reels and short form cinema storytelling before they're going to go into long form storytelling. And there are some examples. I mean, Quinta Brunson's Abbott Elementary began as reels on Instagram. I think sometimes understanding the connection between what the students have seen and the material that they're already bringing in and how to make that kind of dovetail. They might not even have an understanding of that. They're not learning a different language, but they are involved in these multiple ways of seeking stories online and then coming into a classroom where they're being taught a certain system, which feels like, oh, I'm learning something new. It can be a double-edged sword because they're so used to that short form storytelling, the quick and dirty form of filmmaking where a shaky camera, a voice, it doesn't matter as long as you can get it out there, as long as people can respond to it. It's hard to really slow things down for the learner, to get them invested in composition, to have them think about what a 2 minute long piece might mean. I mean, 2 minutes seems long to some of my students because you've been restricted at a minute long reel for Twitter or what have you for TikTok. I think that's a challenge. Attention economy, we speak about that in terms of what students are doing in the classroom. It transfers to everything. It transfers to how they sit in front of a post-production or a project, write about it, think about it, the material that they're shooting, the amount of time that they're pushing the button on a camera to record a shot. All of those are impacted by the quickness of moving on and quickly kind of doing things. The challenge as a professor, as a teacher for me is I am not immersed in that world as much as they are. And so how do I try to understand that sensibility and utilize that in my work? So we're not just ignoring that world completely and saying, well, we're going to do something different, making use of something they already know, but stabilizing it maybe is the bad of a lack of a better
Yeah.
word.
Yeah. That idea of shifting from social media to like classical aspects of filmmaking, that the slowing it down and saying, look at this for 30 seconds in
Yeah.
this one shot. And why are we looking at it? And,
Yeah.
it's funny because a lot of people say, like, well, social media's destroyed everyone's attention span. But yet at the same time, we binge 8-hour series
Yep.
routine. So
Exactly. Yeah.
attention spans
Long
are,
form is not dead, right?
yeah, it's just what people pay attention to,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you see some initiatives, and how do you see them, or do you see them making progress? There's been a very traditional exclusion of women and people of color from especially the higher paid part of the film industry and television industry. How do you see some of these initiatives changing, or, has there been progress? How do you define
Yeah.
progress?
Um, I'm hopeful. I'm more hopeful than I was 10 years ago, when there were no signs of the the resistance, if you may call it that. I think fortunately or unfortunately, the death of George Floyd prompted very across the board unsustainable, but like spasms of goodness that emerged during that time that created some spaces which are now sustaining with that. I think largely, as one would have expected, many of the traditional white dominated spaces that felt that they had to do it have run out of patience and have gone back to the old ways. Where I do find hope is places that set up projects at that time and are continuing with them. One that comes to mind is the Rishi Rajani and his collaborator. Oh darn, I'm forgetting her name. Um, uh, have set up a production company in Hollywood that has invested in hiring not just people who are traditionally and established people in storytelling, but also seeding young people of color their projects. So they have entered into a partnership with Indeed, and they fund 10 filmmakers story scripts, and they make sure that they come to fruition, and they have partnerships with festivals, prominent festivals like Tribeca, and many other places where they're able to showcase the work of these creatives. Um, of course, one institution in a large sea of apathetic and sometimes hostile workplaces will not cut it. So the path is not straightforward. It's very uphill, but I do see shifts in some leaderships. Whether or not the changes in leadership, for instance, the Netflix head of programming is a South Asian woman, Bela Bajaria. Um, will she inform the kind of relationships that happen at the founding stages, or will she and people around her force her into the more traditional ways in which stories are selected? Remains to be seen. I think we saw in Disney, there was a movement initially from Disney Plus in investing in a lot of stories. So we saw the Wonder Woman character coming in the shape of a Pakistani American girl. Those stories, those people that were telling those stories are long gone from Disney because they found it less profitable to tell stories that are specific and unique. And I think the test of the industry, even in the streaming world, has not come to bear fruit for them in the way that they were excited about. So I think the challenges of doing that are not, we can't just look to the few voices here and there. Lena Waite and Rishi Rajani's, Lena Waite was the person I was thinking of, that the few voices that are out there, but that needs to happen in educational institutions, from freshman classes, from the way that we are choosing what to show in the classrooms, from the way that we are supporting student productions, to not just look for imitating certain canons, but looking at the canons themselves and presenting. So I have tried to do that in a small way in my own department. So we proposed a course called Color TV a few years ago, which centers the work of creators of color. It's not just the old representation arguments, like, oh, look what Hollywood has done and how bad it is and how bad people have been projected. Yes, that's part of the opening couple of lectures, but we move on to saying, well, if people of color were able to tell their stories, what stories would they tell? And how are they bringing new aspects to, how are they enriching the landscape of the stories that we do? I think inculcating those types of traditions early into curriculum, and then staying with that within your program, convincing your colleagues that it's not just that one course where it needs to be ghettoized. It has to be across the curriculum. We can't just teach queer studies in one course. It has to be, we have to show queer films in foundations of film. I think that's the fight that I think all of us who are invested in equity are fighting right now. I would not be. I think it's folly to expect that all of these changes will be easy, because these canons have been in place for years, for decades. And to even shake open that canon and to kind of question the canon will invite ridicule. So you have to kind of be very resolute and be informed as to why you're presenting alternatives to them, even to your colleagues, because change is always tricky. That means them having to watch new things that they might not be conversant with. But it is the need of the hour. I mean, I tell the students that are entering Hofstra. I did a speech to honors college graduates. I saying, if you are in the classroom and if you're looking at your syllabus and you're not reflected in that, you should ask why. Why are certain things absent, and why are you not in it? Why are people like you not in that syllabus? And that's, so, it's not easy for students to have the agency already to make those questions, but it's certainly important for us to wonder about that, what they must be thinking.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. And the reclaiming of work of filmmakers of color back all the way to the very, very early days is happening, but so
Yeah.
slowly. And one section of this book is going to talk about Oscar Michaud and his films,
Very cool.
which is, when I think I learned about his work when I was a film student, but it was like one page on the NAACP website
Yeah.
that was there. And I was like, this is amazing. Why are my professors not talking about this? And
Right.
there's so many other biographies, and he's, been given a
Absolutely.
lot of recognition, but like kind of what you're saying, when people of color can make films, what films will they make? And like, I'm reading his bio now, and it's like, there's so much variety of his characters. Like, he was just so prolific. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
what would that mean for generations of filmmakers to learn from his work alongside D.W. Griffith's?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. To have that conversation, right, in the classroom, how enriching would that be, as opposed to that monolithic kind of body of work they've been drawing from, right?
One of the interesting things, I'm paying attention to time, but I do feel like I need to say this. He got censored so much. I'm reading about how his films
Wow.
send New York State. He wanted to screen in Harlem. He had to go through a New York State licensing board because that's what they did. They would censor a film that was 9 reels down to 5 reels. It's like,
Wow.
what did he cut out? Like, I want to see the excerpted parts, like what was the really bad stuff that they didn't want to show. So it's just like tip of the iceberg, to
Yeah.
talk about like race and race stories, and how that just was always a part of the conversations films were having in culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, next one about safety. So I put this in here because of intimacy coordination on sets and rust and what happened with rust. And that looks at sets, but we don't always think about safety in editing, and sometimes there's so much pressure and time schedules. Do you feel like there are health impacts or ways that people going into post-production careers should be thinking about balancing their time or approaching their career so that they can remain healthy and not burn out too quickly?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think about a lot of the editing jobs are like working on the lighthouse. It's you and that flickering light. That's pretty much it. Um, of course, there's a reason why that space is important because the work is immersive and you really are in that tunnel. You're in that journey, and it's hard to kind of come in and out of it. But those long hours can be, in addition to how much time you're spending on screens anyway. Our necks are bent, our fingers are being used in different ways. I think the stresses that we are placing on the editors' bodies are different in the order of magnitude because of the way that we are using devices all the time in our lives. The editor in the old day would get up, would do something, would go out and get coffee, would watch TV in a different way at home, but they might be on their cell phones, they might be on their devices. Um, I'm sure that we're seeing the detriment of what that might cause to the well-being of the average editor. As a young person, you're probably not thinking of it as much because you can just keep going. You can fuel it through all these coffee drinks and so on. But I think there's something about the impact of the way that we're spending time on screens and how the extension of that in the editor's life when we're looking at a screen can have can be a multiplier than in the old times, and that needs to be thought of. Like, what are we doing as an editor? How am I suffering more in the impact of the work that I do uh, because I'm now looking at screens all the time during the course of the day? If you think about the average person's use of cell phone, which is now easy for us to know, the phone tells us that you were looking at this phone for 5 hours yesterday. And if you're editing for another 8 or 6 hours out of that time, that's the whole day that you've been looking at a screen. So that's scary. Um, I think about I mean, I'm a lot older than my students, and I would like to have some longevity of my work as an editor, and I have to make sure that I'm safeguarding my body more often now than I might have done maybe 10 years ago. So absolutely, I think workspaces have to be thought of. The way we jam our laptops anywhere and we start working has to have a long-term impact. I think that a lot of schools and colleges have not thought about the amount of time editors spend doing what they're doing in ill-equipped surroundings. They're not ergonomically suited. They're not the best screens. They're not, the resolutions might be odd. If those factors are kind of brought into play, I think the editor's job would be more pleasant, more healthy, and probably could last longer. I mean, I don't have data that shows what stage people, I mean, the old style editors, I mean, people work like Thelma Schoonmaker, she worked all her life as an editor. How was she able to do it? Maybe narrative projects have a different, amount of time that people spend in edit rooms. Maybe documentary makers, that's the bulk of their work. I mean, documentary editors particularly should be worried about the time they're spending in ill-equipped kind of situations. Just as as a professor, I think about the shoes that I wear because I'm going to be standing in them for 3 hours. I don't, I don't, skimp when I'm buying a pair of shoes, and one should not skimp when you're buying an editor's chair. And I think those are simple questions that you should ask, because why am I doing this? Because it is like the food that I eat. It is like the bed that I sleep in. It's my workplace. I think the approach will probably help if young people start thinking about that and colleges and workplaces start to pay emphasis on that.
Yeah, especially as you're saying, like post-production houses are closing because people are working from home. And so you can have a
Absolutely.
little bit more control too over your
Yeah.
workspace.
Yeah, I know some companies they do. I mean, they give their employees who are working from home because they're now saving a lot of money from not having to lease buildings. They're giving their employees like, here's a budget, make your home office, and make use of that money. But not all companies are that lucky, and freelancers are definitely not that lucky to have a budget. They're given, they're given money only when they finish the work. So
Yeah, yeah, it's a challenge, definitely.
yeah.
Okay, last couple are more back to career entry points. We are in a gig economy, whether we like it or not, unless you're working for a broadcast outlet, and even then it's often a gig or a short-term job. Um, how do you recommend students entering this kind of prepare to navigate and surf the uncertain tides of the gig economy?
Boy, yeah, they're already indoctrinated into thinking that that's the job they're going to have. So it's not as much of a shock because they see their alums out there talk about perma-lancing, which is a term that I detest with all of my viscera. Um, Permanently being freelance, which means no prospect of benefits, or in some cases, maybe some benefits, but never having the certainty of a job. And I think those are the principles that a lot of people in our industry grow up with. They're also growing up with the idea that they will have to maintain not just one, but multiple revenue, multiple ways of making a living. Um, I think the nature of jobs has fragmented. Um, as you mentioned, post houses that used to be a workplace. So you go in and you're doing a bunch of things. You might have be working on one project, and you might be moving on to another. There was a stream of work that funneled into that one place. As a permalancer or a freelancer, you are the one that's having to seek, constantly be on the lookout. Um, I think students in our field uh, cannot have enough preparation for how to present themselves to the future workplace because their friends, they're in the business school or they're in law school or they're in other disciplines where they interview and they get jobs. um, they have to not listen to them. They have to listen to what their future is going to be. And it's heartbreaking that I have to think in this way because uh, we have done this to ourselves in some way, right? Whether we were happy that uh, we were able to edit on our laptops. We were happy that cameras became small enough that DSLRs can shoot films. So they're while they're democratized, but it made many, many more people have access to it, it also changed the nature of work into freelancers, into like fragmented pieces that you can just work for hire. You can just do a small piece of it, and that be the end of it. Having said those things, how does one student um, become, conversant with presenting, but also preparing, whether it's an e-portfolio or a sizzle reel or work that they can, that they can do prior to graduating through the form of internships, through the form of alumni networking. We happen to be lucky. Hofstra alums in New York are everywhere and almost they're in live TV, they're at Post, they're in producing their news. So we are able to get internships, and oftentimes some internships translate into work. But I think students also have to be looking globally. I think the one opportunity that we don't enough talk about enough is what is happening to where productions are going. Production jobs are now not just in the US. If you're an illustrator or an animator, you should be thinking about traveling and doing study abroad, and if you can afford it, or even being part of groups and conferences that allow you to talk to people who might be in the US for a global conference in finding out what types of opportunities they might be looking for. I think, for our discipline, uh, the Hollywood has been globalized for the longest time. People don't talk about it enough. The money for Hollywood comes not from Hollywood alone. It comes from China. It's coming from India. It's coming from a lot of global investments, which means that they have a say in how people can be hired, what can be done to productions, and so on. And that locus is shifting. And I don't think that our students know enough about global opportunities. Being in New York kind of gives you this false sense that this is the be all and end all of what I must be looking to. I and a few other colleagues who have connections to international workplaces and are conversant with how much production work is going on in India, for instance. I mean, I walked into a color correction facility, room after room after room after room, cubicles like just busy banging out, everything from local soap operas to Netflix productions. It's insane. How does one compete in that marketplace? Because those are jobs that are being done, not just they're being shipped abroad, but they are happening in those locations. The production and the editing and the entire production is being done in those locations. So that model of globalization that we used to talk about, where we will be farming work to other people, will be quote unquote outsourcing, that's changed. So how can we become part of that? Uh, what are the internships and what are the relationships that a student in today's environment can avail? I think that nut I haven't cracked myself yet, but I'm interested because I see, we are right now talking about doing a study abroad program for filmmakers in India, and to that might be the first opportunity for our students to sample this big world. I mean, this country that makes the most movies in the world. And there's so many production jobs and opportunities that can come out of that. So we'll see how that goes.
Wow, that is really interesting too that you've been there and just seen it. And yeah, that's what I've heard about the industry. There are far more levels of production than Hollywood ever did.
Absolutely.
We get this
Absolutely.
very false sense of New York, Hollywood. I don't think that paradigm is true anymore.
No.
Maybe it was true 20 years ago, but not now.
Yeah.
But picking up on that, so there's the uncertainty of income, but there's also just what you do. And some people are of the school of like, pick a thing and specialize, be a colorist, be a sound engineer, just do that one thing and then you'll get known that way. Other people are like, no, you're going to go from gig to gig and you want to have multiple skills. Where do you kind of rest on that scale?
I'm in the latter school of thought. I think pigeonholing oneself too early can be detrimental. Um, your skill set might quickly get outdated and you might have nothing to fall back on. If you're learning just one thing and trying to update just that thing, it might take you a while to reskill. If you have multiple arrows in your quiver, to use that metaphor, then of course it is more appealing because you can reskill from one aspect while you still have something else to offer. Um, Having said that, some students are very um, students in the technical field who are so invested in drilling down and understanding and learning something and how it works. Those skills can last. Software skills, on the other hand, are much more rapidly in flux. So if you're a broadcast engineer, if you're somebody who wants to understand, how cloud networks are working, how cloud storage is working, those skills are not going to be outdated very anytime soon. But in the realm of software, people are updating things and they're looking for people that learn the most latest version. I'm not going to knock the idea that skills are skills. If you know how to do color correction, whether you're working on DaVinci or whether you're working on another flavor, it's not going to change the nature of fundamentally what you do. But I'm speaking more to the idea that software options come up more frequently and new opportunities come up a lot. So if you have, for instance, the ability to do assistant editorial work and you have proven yourself, you should be willing to accept that. But if you already set your sights that I'm just going to do one aspect of post work and then keep looking for just those jobs, you're just fighting for a very small section, which very high skilled people, but there are a lot of them as well. Um, the ability to do things across the entire post process, if you're just talking about that, but also being conversant with field production, right? Um, I read somewhere that a lot of Netflix projects, especially the ones that are more docuseries, unscripted reality shows, as we call them, they invite editors to all the production meetings for ideation because they have input at that stage. So I think understanding what that world is like for different formats of productions, and not just assuming that I'm going to learn short storytelling and that skill will get me good in everywhere. If you're looking at multicam shoots that are happening on the Deadliest Catch, and how that workflow is so different from the workflow for a narrative film, having that understanding will equip you. It's like, okay, I've done that work. Diversifying the kind of projects that you work on, that's great for students that uh, are not set on telling us their own stories. But I think the students that do have the desire, that burning flame, that they have story, they have to want to lead a storytelling project, it's hard to talk them into becoming a jack of all trades. They must do what they must do. If they want to write, then I would not dissuade them from saying, "Oh, learn writing, but also pick up some software skills." Um, but I think in the skills sector, I think people are better off pitching themselves as many things that they can do and discover, and maybe pigeonhole yourself down the line. But maybe it's too early now.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it too. And it's hard to say learn everything because you're gonna have because no one can ever be good at
Yeah,
everything or
yeah,
wants to be good at everything. But you don't know, and you just don't know. And I always talk about it like you have to learn how to learn because you're
yeah,
always learning. And if you stop learning, you're not going to keep going. This is a
yeah. And it is hard for me to imagine that in the 4 years that a student spends with us, that they will come to a point where they have the polish and they have done everything, and they're consummate learners, that they can present themselves as one thing to the world. And it's too early for them to even love something, for most of them to love something so deeply at that point, that that's their life from that point on. So I think for many reasons, staying open and discovering whether you want to be in the field. There might be some other pressures that disabuse you from. Maybe you get disenchanted from working in a post house where you're the only person of color. Maybe you're a writer who has ambitions to tell a certain story, and then you walk into a writer's room and you're like the diversity hire, and people can't wait to move on to the next project, and you'll be left behind. I think there are so many reasons to view the industry at an arm's length, and not be invested in, like, I'm just going to be this uh, for the duration of my life. Yeah,
Yeah, and I love that idea of looking internationally and thinking about careers because we think we're in the United States, we think we'll ship out and bring back, and we don't think about ourselves as a labor market for other parts of the world,
absolutely.
which is
That's
a
the new that's
big
the new economy. Yeah.
wow. Well, thank you. Those are all of my questions. That was so in depth.
Okay.
Detailed.
I
Thank you.
enjoyed this tremendously. Thank you for inviting me to this.
My pleasure. I'm gonna follow up with an email with like the next steps, and hopefully the book will get to the final manuscript by the end of this year and get
Oh,
published
that's moving quickly.
early. Yeah, it's gonna be early next year so that it's
Yeah.
ready for fall. And
I
that's
was thinking like a 2-year cycle is kind of typical from the time you start talking about these projects.
they seem we were going kind of fast. They're like, if we can
Yeah,
get it
that's
done, the
good.
manuscript this year, then it'll be published in 2025. So
Cool.
that's good. Yeah, cool. Awesome,
Um,
Ashish. I'm gonna let you know what it is, but also let's get together upstate sometime soon.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll be up there in 2 weeks. Not this weekend and not the following, but after that, I have a cousin visiting from India, so we are planning to bring him up and show him everything that we've been posting on Facebook so far.
Awesome. Well, hopefully we'll find a time, but we'll catch.
Yes, we will.
All
All
right,
right.
take care and have a lovely rest of your day.
You
Thank you.
too. Bye.